All right, with today's lecture, we're going to talk about challenges to development. But first, I'm going to have you guys review a little bit of what we covered last class. So after you look at the slide on what you're doing today in class, make sure you work with your groups to answer the following questions that you'll see on the review slide. So today you're going to review what we covered last class, then you guys are going to listen to this video lecture, then you're going to watch a movie called Living on $1 a Day, based on a group of college students and documentary filmmakers who go down to Central America and actually try living on $1 a day and living like the local people there and see how they fare. And then you, for homework, are going to have a map quiz on Central America and the Caribbean on Tuesday next week. There are PowerPoints up on Google Classroom that you can practice with like you did for your South American map a couple weeks ago. All right, so working with the people at your table, I would like you to take out a scrap piece of paper and write down the answers to the following questions. What factors are considered when looking at or measuring the Human Development Index? 2, what is the difference between gross national product and gross domestic product? 3, where do you find most of your MDCs or more developed countries and your least developed countries or less developed countries based geographically? And then 4th, what indicators are used to measure the Gender Development Index? So these are all reviewed from your notes from last time. So take about 5-10 minutes, answer these questions, and then turn them into your sub, and I will look at these and we'll talk about them next class. All right, so starting with your notes today. So we've already talked about Weber's least cost theory, and we talked about this a little bit with globalization earlier at the beginning of the year when we first got started, but you've had a long chance to look at globalization, migration, population, so now we're kind of tying all the loose ends together. So the dependence theory argues that least developed countries, periphery countries, for the most part, are locked into a cycle of economically not being able to reach the same status as developed countries because they don't have the infrastructure or the support internally through education and political structure to be on the same footing as the more developed countries. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that their political climate often is unstable, and their economic relations with other countries, they often are exporting a lot of raw materials, necessarily importing a lot of manufactured goods. Another aspect is the fact that they don't have the money internally to invest in modernization. If they are going to modernize, they have to rely on money from developed countries to do that infrastructure changes. For example, China currently right now is doing a lot of investment in Africa, whether it's building railways, high-speed rail, or roads, things like that, even factories, to help those countries build up infrastructure, really to open up the way to have access to Africa's resources that have been, a source of envy for the world for a long time. So again, the dependence theory argues that LDCs are dependent upon MDCs for financial and economic support, but the MDCs are dependent on the LDCs to be on top, because if it wasn't for the LDCs wouldn't have a source of raw materials and markets for their goods as well, or a place to get labor and to put their factories as well. And again, a lot of this goes back to these reasons why a lot of places in Africa and Asia are poor is because of how they were treated during colonization by the Europeans. And the late early 1900s, but some people would also argue South America is in that same boat because of the way that the Spanish and the Portuguese treated them going back to the 1600s, and when they got their independence in the early 1800s, they did not have the infrastructure or the political experience to make that transition. So again, the dependence theory, very much like Wallerstein's world model systems, view the world as interconnecting and very dependent upon each other, and MBCs could exist without LDCs, and LDCs could exist without MBCs. And what happens in one country is going to impact another. So if there's a recession in developed countries, then that's going to impact their power to buy from LDCs, get raw materials, and then if they're having an issue, then the LDCs are going to have issues with their economy because of the fact that there isn't a market for the goods that they're trying to export. All right, the core periphery model is a review of Wallerstein's world model system that we talked about again back in globalization, arguing that the countries can be divided into 3 levels based on their economic development. Core countries are industrialized, they have the highest income per capita and highest standard of living. So obviously examples, most of Western Europe and Asia, Japan, New Zealand, Australia in the Pacific, US and Canada and North America. Semi-periphery countries are countries that are newly industrialized but have not caught up to the standard of living or the income level that your average person has in core countries. So again, going back to what we talked about with industry, this is where your BRIC nations come in. So Brazil, India, China, Russia also fits into here, so does South America. And then your periphery nations are countries that are industrializing, but they're just beginning. Again, most of their income is based on agriculture or extraction of raw materials. This is also where you're going to find a lot of labor-intensive factories that core countries or semi-periphery countries have moved their factories to take advantage of the large population but low cost of living, so they can pay them a low wage. So again, these countries do not have a high level of infrastructure. The roads aren't connected very well. Communications poor, and so your average person has a low level of standard of living and low level of income as well, mostly because they don't have the economic opportunities that folks in semi-periphery and core countries do. All right, again, Wallerstein came up with the world model system, which again talks about the core, periphery, and semi-periphery. And again, he argued, and this is kind of a review of what we were talking about, globalization, that it grew out of exploration and colonialization, and it's unequal because, again, the core countries dominate over the semi-periphery and the periphery countries. So that those two movements have had a long-lasting impact, way beyond the 300 years where 400 years actually where colonization took place in the New World, and then obviously almost 100 years now from when imperialism happened in Africa and parts of Asia. There are 2 ways that LDCs tried to promote development. One is through self-sufficiency, where they develop their own economy, and the other one is focusing on international trade. So we're going to start with self-sufficiency first. All right, so with self-sufficiency, what you've got is trying to develop a country's economy very quickly to try and level the playing field between the rich and the poor in the country, also trying to lessen the dependency of the country on foreign imports and trying to foster industry and the local economy or the national economy, as opposed to relying on the foreign companies coming in and doing business in the country itself. So essentially what you have is the goal is to reduce poverty throughout the country, to limit imports by putting tariffs on imported goods, and doing that so that local businesses do not have to compete with foreign companies who can do things much cheaper. The one tough thing about self-sufficiency is that it really limits competition. So creativity or innovation necessarily always happen when countries go to this model. India is an example. Right after India gained its independence from Great Britain, they tried the self-sufficiency model. So what happened was that if the Indians were going to import goods from other countries, they had to secure, there's a lot of bureaucratic activity. They had to secure a license. Once a company got a license, they were restricted at how much they could sell in India. There was heavy tariffs on the imported goods, and Indian businesses were discouraged from importing foreign goods. And but Indian businesses who were, again, the idea was to try and promote business in India, to try and encourage Indian companies to do manufacturing. They had to get government approval for new products, and the government set prices. So the problem with this, there was a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of hoops that people had to go through, and it kind of stifled the whole idea. So what you have is a two big problem is one, it was inefficient. For one, businesses could sell, the government controlled the prices, customers were on a long waiting list, so there was not enough being produced. Two, there was no need to improve quality because there was very little competition, so people were kind of stuck buying one brand of the various product. And again, because they did not have to keep up with competition, the technology was kind of stagnant, so they weren't as being innovative as they could if they were trying to compete with international technology, international competition. The other thing is, because of having to deal with the bureaucracy of setting prices and licenses for Indian companies, but then also having licenses and tariffs for foreign companies, the bureaucracies got so big India just couldn't maintain it. So ultimately, people bought things in the black market, and that kind of undermined the whole idea. So India did not stay with the self-sufficiency model for very long. All right, the other option to move LDCs to having more of a developed economy towards industrialization is what we call the international trade approach, which takes underdeveloped countries and helps them to figure out an industry or how to strengthen their economy by looking at something that they can offer other countries that will help strengthen their industry. That eventually they will find a niche that will give them an advantage over other countries in the world. So this is what we call a comparative advantage. So a country becomes better at than any other country, whether it's manufacturing or providing a certain service than the other country. It's called a comparative advantage. Yes, that's my dog in the back. So Rostow developed this model in the 1950s to kind of predict how countries would develop their economies. So currently, MDCs, or more developed countries, are in stages 4 and 5, and LDCs are somewhere between stages 1 and 3. So he argues that once countries start investing in their economy, putting money towards their economy, then they will begin to develop. So, and it's just a matter of time. So first of all, he argues that stage 1 is a country that's based on agriculture, possibly extraction of some raw materials, but mostly agriculture. Stage 2 is where they find a need to start kind of preparing for industry. For example, they might be going to war a lot. They might need to start manufacturing military weapons or something like that. A classic example is Great Britain. For a long time, Britain was an agricultural society. things are being made at home. In the mid-1700s, you're going between colonies in the Americas and overseas. In Asia, they're going to start to have money where they can invest, and you're going to have people experimenting with technology. A bunch of natural resources like coal and iron prepared them to get into the takeoff stage, where you find one industry that your country is good at manufacturing, and you start with that. So for Britain, it was a textile industry, so they used that as their springboard for manufacturing. And then once that is successful, then you go from one industry to several industries in manufacturing. And that's where you go from stage 3. So you have 1 or 2 industries that you are manufacturing, to stage 4, where a lot of your economy is based on manufacturing, and then stage 5, where the focus isn't necessarily manufacturing, but on consumption. So you might not be producing things, but you are buying from other countries that are, so everyone has a high enough income that pretty much everybody in the country can afford pretty much at least the basics, from televisions to cell phones to clothes that they don't have to make, things like that. So that's the 5 steps of the Rothschild model, development model. All right, so another group that you will see in operating today between developing countries, what we call NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. These are organizations that are run by charities and private organizations that provide a lot of services that governments would normally provide, like health services, education, economic development. For example, in the video documentary we're going to watch, there are NGOs that give loans called microloans. So they will loan $100 or $500 to individuals, but what they have to do is they have to pay, as they pay back that loan, they also have to actually save money. So for every dollar that they put towards that loan, they have to save $1. So it forces them to have a savings account as well as they're paying back the loan. Some examples of NGOs would be Doctors Without Borders. So doctors from developed countries will go into developing nations and provide health care, surgeries, dental work, things like that, that most people can't afford, and it's free. Another example would be relief organizations that will go in and people can adopt a child and provide them with meals and education, for a sponsorship for so many dollars a month, things like that. So those are a couple examples of NGOs. There are tons of them out there that go in and have various causes. A lot of them will work with education and providing folks, particularly girls in certain countries where girls do not necessarily have educating girls are not a priority, and set up schools for them. So different things like that. So there are all kinds of NGOs out there. Fair trade. We talked about this a little bit with agriculture before. But fair trade is kind of a take on an international trade model. Essentially what this is that these are products, usually for small businesses. Particularly if you go in the organic section of the grocery store, you'll see fair trade on this. And these are businesses that help workers and LDCs make sure that they're not being exploited. So they help make sure the workers are paid fairly, a decent wage, that their working conditions are decent, and things like that. So producers, one, work with small businesses, make sure that the workers have a say-so in the running of the company, things like that. And they charge a little bit more for the product, letting the consumer know that the folks who produce that product got a decent wage and it's of higher quality. And again, working standards to be fair trade. They have fair wages. They're allowed to unionize, and they have certain minimal environmental standards, things like that. So there are a lot of things that are pretty much a given here in this country that would apply to fair trade products that are fair trade. So anytime you see something that says fair trade on it, those workers have a fair wages that are probably higher than most in that country. They're allowed to organize, have a say so, and they really have a stake in that company. And their working conditions were pretty safe. All right, globalization. As we said before, globalization is a term that the economies are connected pretty well within the world today. We've already talked about the International Division of Labor. So again, breaking down various pieces of manufacturing in different countries and then assembling it in another country. For example, the iPhone, which I've used example many times. And again, often LDCs are dependent upon the investment of MDCs to make all this work. And unfortunately, a lot of the investment of MDCs has an influence on the decisions that governments and LDCs make because the economies are so dependent upon this investment of corporations that are based in MDCs. All right. So international division of labor. So there's kind of argument, does fair trade interfere with free trade? So again, MDCs allowing them to outsource without having to any regulation. Is that messing up capitalism? Globalization? Some people argue that, again, with direct investment in countries like China, going and investing in Kenya or Ethiopia, is not fair. Like it's giving them an advantage in certain countries, different things like that. Some people argue that it's helping. So, that many people are being exploited by some companies because, again, if you go to China, the workers are being paid maybe $2-3 an hour, where in the United States, minimum wage is at least $7, and they're working in much harsher conditions without safety protocols. So again, globalization can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. And again, fair trade involves looking at oversight, taking into account that workers are getting a fair shake, that they're having a safe work environment, decent wages, things like that, things that we take for granted here, but it's also encouraging people, having people to pay a higher price for that. So are people willing to do that? And that's a question that still remains to be answered. All right, environmental impacts from development and globalization. One, sustainable development. Can we continue this rate of development from generation to generation? Can we continue to the rate of manufacturing and development with our natural resources? Are we going to use them up? That's a question. There is definitely a huge move to more sustainable development, so to use our resources more wisely so that there is more resources for the next generation. A couple other things that we have is ecotourism. So with transportation, people can go places where they hadn't gone before. So a lot of exotic landscapes are attracting tourism, and that is impacting the environment, particularly like in the rainforest of Costa Rica or in Vietnam. So ecotourism allows tourist operations to happen, but they do it so they're not really hurting the environment. So that's a big thing, is that allowing tourism to help economies of LDCs, but at the same time not having a huge impact on the environment as well. All right, a couple other impacts. Okay, so you've got greenhouse gases through increase in transportation, factories. You've got more chemicals in the air, carbon dioxide, which is increasing the temperature, which then in turn is impacting global warming. And again, that's causing even consequences, polar ice caps to melt, sea levels rising, and we've seen evidence of that with glaciers melting and sea levels, like Florida, the Keys are flooding more every year, and it's taking longer for the waters to recede. So the biggest, just look at the report that the federal government just released, giving warnings and recommendations to try and adapt to climate change over the next several years, and if we don't, the repercussions of that. So whether you agree with it or not, there's a lot of strong scientific evidence that greenhouse gases and global warming are there. They're taking a toll on